Before we start this video, I want you to go to the blah blah below, that's the comments, and let me know what is the first time you remember disregarding, changing, or ignoring a rule in your game. What was it and what happened? This is a small channel, I don't get many comments, so if you comment below, I'm gonna see it, heart it, and probably respond, so let's get a conversation going. At some point in their ttrpg journey, most people ask the question, what are rules for? This is a great question because it doesn't have an obvious answer. In games that are not ttrpgs, like board games, sports, and card games, there are winners and losers. In those games, that's why we need rules, to say who won and who lost, to make the game fair. But in ttrpgs, what are rules for? Why not just make everything up from scratch every time you play the game? Let's take this seriously for a second. When you run the game, you have player characters and you tell the players the situation of their characters, and then players tell you what their character does, and then you tell them what happens next. But in some situations, the answer for what happens next is not obvious. In other words, there is some ambiguity in the results. Let's say one of your players, Greg, has a character and he asks, can my character climb this fence? And you think to yourself for a second and you say, yes, your character can climb this fence. Now let's say there is another player, her name is Isabel, and she says that her character is going to follow Greg's character and climb the same fence. And say that in the story you're playing, Isabel's character is a librarian who is very smart but not very strong, and Greg's character is a ranger who is pretty strong and can reasonably climb over fences. The GM might say, Isabel, your character cannot climb the fence because they are not strong enough. Now let's say there is some third character and they are somewhere in the middle, and they say, well, can my character climb the fence? And somewhere it becomes ambiguous why the GM decides yes in some cases and no in other cases. What if tomorrow's game has a different fence which is slightly taller? Maybe one character can make it over and the other can't. If you make on-the-spot rulings all the time, your rulings are going to end up being inconsistent and feel unfair for your players. Players will never know what to expect, so they won't be able to make meaningful decisions. The decisions won't be meaningful because they can't anticipate the outcome of the actions. And that's why I think we have rules. That's what rules are for. One, to resolve ambiguity in the game in a way that is good and consistent. And two, we write these rules down so we can share them with other people and they can rule their games in ways that are good and consistent. So now you know what the rules are for. Maybe this is something that you already figured out along the way. Great. But in order to use the rules, we know what they're for. In order to use them, we need to maybe know what are rules. We can say, well, GDS, rules are just words that describe the game and how it works, and that's it, and the question is silly. And it might seem so, but I think rules are more than that. Just entertain me for a second. At some point running the game, people do one of the following. 1, ignore a rule or several rules on accident or on purpose. 2, change a rule or add a rule, i.e. homebrewing. And 3, make on-the-fly rulings, deciding the outcome of ambiguous actions, just based on their own feelings of how things would work, rather than by looking up the rules. And yet, even though you can make all these 3 changes to the rules of the game, most people would say that everyone making these changes are still playing the same game. People would only say that a GM is playing a different game if that GM has made enough changes to the original game. For example, if you have Pathfinder and you start adding sci-fi elements to it, you may say at a certain point it's still Pathfinder, but past a certain threshold between Pathfinder and Starfinder, it becomes Starfinder. People may not know exactly where that threshold is, but they can know that it exists somewhere between Pathfinder and Starfinder. This reveals an ambiguity in our original definition of what rules are, i.e. that rules are words that define what a game is and how it works. Like we just said, people can make changes to the rules and still consider it the same game until they make enough changes such that people consider it a different game. So in this case, the game is not something set in stone, it's more like a general space of ideas. A certain area of rule configurations where we can all agree, or maybe even the creator says, that this is still the game. So now we can change our original definition of what the rules are to now, rules are words that describe or constrain a general space of ideas that either we by consensus or the creator define as the game. An analogy for this is like the difference between a knife and a sword. There is no set-in-stone definition that we find in the world, retrieve, and discover for what a knife is and what a sword is. Rather, there is a general configuration of attributes that an object can have, such that we would consider it a knife. It needs to be short enough and have a certain kind of handle, and maybe sliced a certain way. The same would be true of a sword, and you could imagine objects that are between a knife and a sword, and you could ask yourself, is this a knife or is this a sword? It's unclear, but at the very least, we can say that the ideas of the knife and the idea of the sword are not one specific thing, but rather a space of ideas or a space of attributes that we would correlate to either a knife or a sword. You can also say that you don't know exactly where that threshold is when something becomes a sword from a knife or a knife from a sword, but you can say to yourself that this does exist because these seem to be like separate ideas in our heads. So now we've refined our definition for what are rules, and you may say to yourself at this point, why do I care? Because I don't care about the rules in themselves, I care about the rules as a means to an end. I don't play D&D to play D&D. I play D&D to have fun with my friends. In other words, you may say, and I think I would agree, who cares about the space of ideas or any of that? I just care about the rules because I want to have fun. This is, I think, the right way to go. But then the problem is, if we don't care at all about the space of ideas that, say, people consider as D&D, and we have no obligation to make our rulings or our decisions according to that space of ideas, how do we choose what ruling to do or what rules to follow? After all, particular games like D&D are just instantiations of particular ideas that are identified either by a consensus of people or by the creator of the game. But in reality, there are so many configurations of rules. There are so many lengths a blade can have between a knife and a sword. So if you don't care at all about the idea space of the game you're playing, how do you choose what rules to have in your game? Honestly, I think we just choose based on personal preference. Whatever we feel we need the rules to be. And so for us GMs, that makes the rules just examples. And I really mean that. I really think that every single rule in any ttrpg book is an example. A suggestion for how you could resolve in-game ambiguity, if you want to take it. By this, I don't mean that the rules are some abstract framework that exists somewhere out there that you as a GM need to understand and then actualize in your game. What I mean is that each rule that is written down in the book is literally a concrete example of a ruling you could make to resolve a certain ambiguity in the game. I don't think I am the first person to think about rules as examples, but I do think that once you understand this is true, once you understand that this is true, you can unlock your potential as a GM. I've often said in other videos that I think the job of the GM is very similar to the job of a game designer. And now that we know that rules are just examples or rulings, this makes sense. GMs make rulings all the time, and you shouldn't feel like your rulings are any less real than the official rules. People will tell you that the rules for their preference of D20 fantasy game have been carefully curated and tested by infallible designers who decalcify their pineal gland and achieve transcendence by opening their third eye. To the online people, when you change or disregard a rule, you ignore revealed wisdom by someone infinitely smarter and more capable than you. They don't say this exactly, but it's what they mean. Don't listen. You should not feel like you're committing heresy when you're changing or ignoring a rule. You're not. The designers of the game are not sitting behind the screen running a game for your friends. You are. Rulings become rules when they're written down. That's the only difference. In this regard, since rules are examples, there is no such thing as breaking the rules, only disregarding. In my experience, creativity and self-expression require, how do I say this, a healthy disregard of the rules. In fact, I find that what separates a novice from a master is that novice break rules all the time by mistake, and masters break rules all the time on purpose. By the way, apropos rules as examples, I think this is why it's often beneficial to be reading rules for other games, even if they're not TTRPGs. like board games. Our brains are not the best at synthesizing ideas out of nothing, but our brains are really good at making inferences and connections between examples that we're given. Think of it like an AI. The more rules or examples you can train it on, train yourself on, the better. Something like ChatGPT is a large language model, and in fact, rules as examples are not too far off from languages. You can only learn languages with examples and associations. Like when you're a child and you're shown an object, apple, and taught to associate the object apple with a word, apple. And even when you learn languages as an adult, you'll learn them by examples. For example, this is how you say apple in X language. So the more training on examples or rules that you can give yourself as a GM, the stronger your GM muscles will be, I think. Somebody should make a video about that, and they should call it language, not rules. That said, and this is my final point, rules are still very important. You may think that because rules are only examples, they're not important. After all, I just told you that having a healthy disregard for the rules is good. But there is nothing inherently unimportant about examples. When designers design rules, they are creating a dataset of examples that players and GMs will be trained on. This means that even as examples, nothing is more important for the identity of the game than rules. And the better the examples or rules that designers make, the better the GMs and players can communicate with one another. The more vocabulary they have, the more sentences they can put together, and ideas that they can express. I don't know exactly what lesson I want you to take away from this video. This was more of a meditation, not like a Zen meditation, but thinking about ideas deeply. And I hope you got something from it. And if you did, maybe let me know now that we're at the end of the video. If you did like the video, make sure to, with your fist, smash the like button. I mean that quite literally. If you have a monitor, just punch it as hard as you can. If it's a touch monitor, of course, or a smartphone, or use your mouse, click the like button an odd number of times. Let's go for 3. And if you're not subscribed, please join if you like these kinds of videos. I hear there's a bell, and you can get notifications. I can't tell you how much this stuff helps me because I honestly don't know. I don't know how the algorithm works, but I hear it helps. We have a Discord. It's not a secret. It's in the nonsense below, so come join, and that's pretty much it. I'll see you later.